There are further distinctions that I must make just to clear some things up because I was a bit vague around talking about the narrative and stuff. So let me just start from the NV filter. So the NV filter is not the same thing as the NV concealment. The NV concealment is the same thing as the narrative, but and then when I go on to explain the content of the narrative, the web of intellectual sympathy, let me just rephrase all of that in different words just so that it simplifies. So it's like the NV concealment often is just centered around producing a contrast between things that are obviously different. And then essentially you're trying to spin a yarn about that difference as to why it is an imposition. In some sense, um, it's almost paradoxical because it's just like identity politics, where the claim is that systemic oppression is being imposed because of the difference. And so you're just interpreting the differences to mean that there's a narrative imposition from the other, from the system itself, from the collective guilt or the collective amalgamated responsibility and accountability. So there's this automatic fabric of shared culpability between the community, within the community, or something like that, and that the community itself, the overarching category itself, is imposing something, which is now that general claim or that general conceptualization is a narrative which is fulfilling the NV concealment. And the concealment of the NV means the concealment of the NV filter in some sense, which is stopping anything from disrupting the greed in the inner child. So the inner child is greedy to be seen as high status, and it just wants to be granted that role of just having high status. And so subconsciously, within the feeling body, they are creating a narrative or a complaint, um, uh, which is, because there I just went from the greed to envy concealment, skipping over the envy filter, but essentially the envy filter is almost is an implicit secondary factor uh, that is also operating at the same time as the envy concealment. But these things, yeah, they should be modeled or seen as distinct, because otherwise it will you won't be able to track all these things and how they function. So so obviously if you want to conceal envy, well, I guess in this model in terms of the subconscious components of the false ego complex, um, uh, the function of the envy concealment is to facilitate the envy filter, which is protecting the inner child's greed, to be granted high status, to just be granted that belief. And in terms of the envy filter, it's because it is owed deference. It is just owed a kind of automatic acquiescence to its demands because of the envy concealment narrative around some kind of inequity in terms of the differences between something, the contrast in something. And so when I am calling it an agent of chaos, it's creating that formulaic reduction of how to solve a problem which appears in this context, in this formula. It's almost like a heuristic for handling things. In some sense, you could say that, I mean, it's interesting because I wonder if you could sort of you could spin a kind of overarching thematic story that perhaps borderline is created as a form of self-preservation. I don't think that that is enough. I think that's a bit too um, what's the word that means uh, like clinically clean. Uh, that's just a bit too uh, sanitized. I don't believe that it's not just for to promote self preservation. I mean, I guess in some sense you could say that they have redefined self preservation to be this form of control in some sense, and that's the kind of justification to deploy all these sophisticated structures that are just essentially there to feed off other people's subconscious aspects. I mean, obviously there are a lot of traumatized people, people that are traumatized by childhood, but a lot of these kinds of traumas, I think, are it's quite. I think a lot of them can be. It's interesting. You obviously you have to have trauma in the environment to inculcate this kind of development of a personality disorder, but there's quite a strong line of involvement in sort of, you know, these structures. They don't just happen to you passively. You actively, deliberately construct them. Yes, they're very hard to get underneath after you've constructed them, perhaps once you've habituated yourself to them. Anyway, that's not a fruitful line of thought anyway. I was just, I guess, going over the kind of the moral quandary of the self that has committed itself to this form of captivity. But it doesn't really quite matter because, you know, unless they start taking responsibility for the shit, it doesn't, you know, they won't cease it anyway. But in some sense, they've found something so close to the core of human beings, and they've essentially decided to try to harness it and harvest it, uh, uh, to have mastery over it. So they have a kind of this ingrained pattern of. I mean, in some sense, you know, you could say that it's just kind of like a narcissist who, a very eccentric form of narcissist, who broke their own rule to enter into the subconscious just to control the subconsciousnesses of other people. That could be sort of the definition of what a narcissist is. And then a histrionic has sort of done that, but then forgotten that they were even doing that, and then started believing in the dream themselves, in the facade. They started believing in the bait, the lure that the borderline tries to do in order to entangle their host. The histrionic essentially just stabilized that lure into an actual persona and decided to develop that one. And so, actually, I mean, a lot of children. That's how children develop. Is they actually have more than one subconscious variant, and they haven't quite, settled on which one necessarily. I'm too tired to make these recordings properly. I'm just going to stop. Did I say everything I wanted to say? Yeah, so I just wanted to clearly delineate the envy filter from the envy concealment, which is usually a fixation and an obsession with differences, like feminism being the most prime one. Obviously men and women are different. They have developed different general distinctive roles relative to one another in a generalized sense because of a whole lot of factors in some sense. A lot of those factors being biology and temperament themselves, but those differences are leveraged in a very regimented way that is a kind of to me, I can only describe it as the imposition of envy concealment. And then, when that's being treated in a form of envy concealment, then the narrative is being serviced, as well as the end. When I say the narrative is being serviced, I mean the ego function cloud is being fed its moral certitude and sanctimony and self-righteousness, while at the same time the envy filter is kept clear of any potential backflow of any kind of reciprocity. So it's weird that you seem to be imposing a form of reciprocity so that you can okay, I just interrupted. Okay, so the backflow, I was going to get into describing how reciprocity, how there's a sort of it's interesting. There's a mini like doubling down of the hypocrisy in some sense because of essentially the imposition of a paradox. So because the person is ostensibly trying to impose a form of rectifying reciprocity, they're trying to restructure the narrative to fix it, to solve a problem of an inequity. And so as they are trying to vindicate and advance a difference that hasn't been catered to properly or served uh, or respected in some sense, uh, they are like, obviously, to the extent to which that they are making that aspersion directly, they've sort of laid claim before anyone else, or at least conceptually they try to play this game where it's like they've leveraged this complaint first, therefore it must be dealt with first before anything else is dealt with. So they imagine themselves to be immune to a counter polemic, essentially, that directly inverts their claim in some sense. you know, it's like, you know, and this is the kind of vagueness that histrionics also, you know, apply their specious interpretation to. And this is how they dance around criticism and critique by essentially misinterpreting any kind of criticism that comes their way because, like, oh, it's just common sense that their claim must be adjudicated first, and if another person is making an inverse claim, then they are essentially just trying to play some strange kind of obfuscation. So because essentially this, you know, it's like a preemptive obfuscation in some sense, um, and that's the way in which the envy filter, in some sense, protects the greed of the inner child for wishing to be granted some sort of automatic high status or prestige. Yeah, I didn't explain that well, but essentially because they're always leveraging this narrative, or focusing on a difference, which they are are asking for equal treatment on some heuristic that they have to fabricate or manufacture. Because how can you ask for equality about something that is fundamentally not the same? So you have to make it the same in some way. And so, in the way that you make it the same, uh, you see that they're not actually doing that because they are trying to say two things at once. They are trying to say that it is both equal and different. They're not trying to say that it's equal and the same. They're trying to say that it's equal and different. And they use that sort of that very strange kind of ambiguity where I mean, essentially they're saying two things: is that we should be equal because we're the same, and we should be equal because we are different. You know, it's that kind of, how the one-way valve works on the envy filter that protects the inner child's greed. Um, is that they're running both of those premises simultaneously, which essentially gives them a whole range of confected uh, uh, sort of holograms to project onto what's really going on. Man, that's a good depiction of it, but it's not such a good explanation. I'm just trying to ground this better. I mean, it really is a kind of, in some sense, it is confusing. It is it is intended to be a confusion that is imposed. Um, it's a it's a it's a conflated thing. It's a convoluted thing that is being enforced as the framework that other people have to engage with in order to uh, try to find a common agreement with them. In some sense, the only real way to, like, actually, you know, manage a borderline in some sense is to not need an agreement with them. And then, you know, then they find you toxic, and then they find you problematic. The problem is that it's very easy for them to escalate non-agreement into any kind of radical complaint that they can imagine. You know, they can really invent ancillary contexts to weave your disagreement into, you know, a crime essentially. So I mean, they're very dangerous because they can manipulate contexts very, very easily, and they can get people to play along to just the degree to which that they can record enough and get people to sort of to, to interpret enough that then they can sort of concoct an entire scenario, um, which then they can leverage. So it's like, I mean, they don't have any ethical limits. There is no, um, uh, in some sense, their ethical limit is, to what extent they feel like they have something to lose in terms of how much they could tolerate being caught out, and if they think that they could essentially, I mean, they are at the end of the day, at least borderlines are, um, conserving that sense of greed. So, I mean, if they do something in which they might get caught out and it might cause a certain level of self destruction, as long as that self destruction has a potential for being even further leveraged down the road, it's not necessary, like they are really capable of sabotaging themselves, um, for the big, because they have high standards. They have high standards that they're aiming for, and they can't tolerate loss on not achieving those high standards in some sense. So, it's kind of like all or nothing. And so they'll just keep on doubling down, keep on doubling down. And essentially they can keep on shifting around these differences to the next white knight. They can just keep on having a bigger snowball to pass on as the latest quandary for the next white knight to sort of do the work of facilitating and uh, I can't think of a good enough word, satisfying the general bundle of accumulated expectations. So as the snowball grows and is handed on to the next and the next and the next, it's just an absolute mountain of expectations which just gets bundled one upon the other. Um, and these people, they are sad because when they're young, or when they still have their youth to some degree, uh, they have the vision that it can all work out because they just need to hit the jackpot once in some sense, and then all the ships will sail to port, and all the chickens will come home to roost. Um, in terms of the payoff, in terms of what they've been expecting and what they've been gaming everything towards. Um, and then when that starts to sort of run out, it's perhaps quite desperate and dangerous. It's kind of like Germany in the late stages of the war. Anyway, in the Second World War. Okay, what was I saying? Okay, let me go back and talk to this and talk about this issue one last time. So, what was I talking about? I was talking about the envy concealment, leveraging differences, and using complaints about differences to create that web of intellectual sympathy and that currency of intellectual sympathy within a kind of narrative, a consolidated system that everyone becomes just automatically enraptured by and adopted by and and must conform to that categorization, and therefore must be sensitive to the complaint that is being issued by the borderline. So I don't. There was something else that I wanted to say. Is that when they leverage these differences, and I guess I think in the ideological analogy, even, but also borderlines themselves in some sense, well, it's very off-putting when you're on the receiving end of that kind of exchange or that kind of transaction that they're trying to facilitate, because they only care about essentially submission or subjugation or getting their coercive hooks into you in some sense. And so, it's weird because this kind of the so-called parity that they're suing for, the so-called equality that they're demanding, is completely arbitrary. They're only asking for it as a kind of contemplative um, excuse to have their narrative imposed, to have their narrative absorbed, to have someone resonate with that uh, with their relaying of the narrative, with them representing the voice of the cloud, of the ego function in some sense. And once they've got any kind of conciliation to that exchange, to that kind of transaction, to that style of interaction, then they've essentially contracted your free will, at least the free will of your subconscious feeling body, of your social mask. That they've got you woven into their web of intellectual sympathy, and you'll find out very quickly that they're like an eel in water, that they are so quick and agile within that medium that they can concoct, and they can, it's like magic, that they can conjure reality at will, and they can uh, captivate, and generally it's a slow degrading. It starts off with honey, and then it's just cracking the whip. It's just, it's just nastiness. It's just your integrity is on the line. They're always just sort of threatening you, you know that you know that you're not following the script of the narrative, and you're not following the script that's depicted by the intellectual sympathy. And uh, and essentially their conduit for enforcing this is that their negative emotion within themselves is the loudspeaker of the what was that word that I used before, compatriotism. You must show your level of allyship, and you can see how the role of the ally, the role of the compatriot, is this weird kind of ideological serfdom, uh, which you're supposed to kind of feel. What's the word? You're supposed to feel uh, proud about being. I can't think of the right word, but you're supposed to feel good and solemn in that role. It's a weird kind of diminutive pride in some sense. And I mean, this is why the Germans have their stereotypes of their sexual dysfunction, as it were, or their sexual extravagance and decadence, it came from this culture. It came from the fascist culture. It came from the Second World War. It came from this culture that now is everywhere, that now is all over the world. Everyone has been infected by this shit. Um, this borderline perversion um, through this ideological vector. Uh, okay, well, okay, now I'm just babbling a bit, so I'm just going to stop this recording now. But that's I think everything I wanted to say. Okay, I've had some rest now, and so I'm just going to get back into just going into some ancillary issues around this. So, I mean, I could have done a better job, but I'm not going to retrace too much of that strange kind of nebulous space, which is itself fundamentally confused, and it is both a kind of the wonderland that is the kind of fascist ideology space in some sense, which is which correlates to the borderlines um, sort of to the ambiguity created in the borderline uh, when uh, in some sense the borderline doesn't get to enjoy this ambiguity, but they use it to leverage it defensively. They use it to reduce reality and to interpret reality into always a convenient and expedient way to continue the envy filter. So in terms of the ambiguity, it's closest to the envy filter, and then in the histrionic, the ambiguity is part of the kind of the social game of, in some sense, they're quite adept to the ambiguity and they leverage it. They try to leverage it creatively in some sense, which gets very disorientated and delusional in some sense. And so in the sense that the ideology version of fascism, of identity politics, uses that same kind of ambiguity all the time, it creates, you know, like these mini towers of Babel. It creates these mini sort of cognitive dissonances that, you know, sort of enrapture a lot of focus and attention and energy, and then, you know, like it doesn't lead anywhere because it's built on sand in some sense. So it's like, you know, it's the extravagant juggling that the histrionic is sort of doing, and they're sort of, you know, building sandcastles and then moving on to the next sandcastle. Um, and they have to find a bigger sandcastle to displace the attention that was being invested into the last sandcastle. So it's you know, and that's the kind of the general unsustainability of the fascist culture, as it were. Um, Obviously, a natural histrionic, not the ideological sort of aversion, can do this more stably because they can kind of keep the ambiguity to a set of themes, and then essentially it's just a kind of the same sophistry being deployed, and they don't check themselves. They somehow, they're not even interested that the actual substantive issue is being badly treated, and there's this like fundamental incoherence. You know, they're kind of immune to it, and if somebody else is trying to talk to them about that incoherence or trying to depict it to them or analogize it, you see this in the Stefan Molyneux and the rationality rules discussion. Perfect example of this. Um, it just, you know, they can just interpret it as a kind of cross purposes, you know, like, oh, well, that's because you've got this convoluted set of things, and they are really contending a very simple set of technical equivocations which they are immune to invigilating about themselves. They're immune to sort of spelling those out because they're just traditional authoritarian relics, you know, that, oh, well, obviously the is-ought divide is represented by the categorical and hypothetical imperative uh, um, distinction. You know, that's just absolutely assumed. You know, even though within that dialogue, within that discussion, um, it, you know, like that was never established, and that was obviously, you know, some would blame Stefan slightly for not sort of underscoring that, but you know, it's very hard to do when your interlocutor is that intellectually dishonest, essentially, and is conducting that level of intellectual fraud constantly, and essentially putting you off the trail by throwing out, you know, these prickly sort of sadistically edged technical reframes and constantly have you on the defensive. So that's the general style of the histrionic. Um, yeah. So anyway, I referenced that debate in some of my earlier recordings, so they'll have a link there if you want to see it yourself. And I also have a more detailed breakdown of what I think is going on there intellectually. Um, okay, so I wanted to talk now about. Now this is going to be very speculative because obviously I'm not an expert in this other than reading uh, some decent books on the difference between the sexes, and obviously I think well psychology and biology is an interesting Venn diagram. But anyway, I think the reason why borderlines develop as they do, in some sense, I think narcissism in some sense is almost like archetypally the base defense mechanism for chaos in a child's life or something like that. And I do think that in some sense, the reason why, let's say, more male children become narcissists and more female children become borderline is because of the the biological and psychosocial combination that girls turn into women, women have small children need to be looked after in a certain way. Therefore, you have to have a handle on your external social status or something like that. That's why women, hypergamy is a really good general reduction of essentially what women are prone to seeking, and it is a good sort of generalization of their sexual strategy within the sexual marketplace, and how they um, uh, 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 pursue their sexual competitive tactic or anyway. So the in some sense, I think that the borderline in some sense would have just been a narcissist like the male. In some sense, the male is more prone to just sort of doing it all in house. So if the male wants to be unassailable or something like that, they make it true within their belief structure. And although they can sort of have an inverted subconscious in some sense, they're doing it all themselves. They're running it all themselves. They actually have to model everything themselves. So in some sense, they're doing it all in house. They have to model it sort of in an objective world. They are really becoming the architect in some sense. And then ironically, the female wants the same kind of control, but they want to outsource that architect role, um, using a kind of subconscious attachment device to somebody else's subconscious host in some sense. And this allows the borderline in some meta sense to be uh, more pragmatic. But I guess what also should be noted is that, let's just say, perhaps the natural inclination of the female to look at society and look at things, or maybe it's just psychosocially because girls and women are already given this kind of leeway, they're already given this kind of space, the psychosocial space to be thinking in those dimensions, that they are allowed to abrogate certain powers to themselves. They're allowed a certain female privilege because it is expected that they might have a small child, and so then they need a certain wider berth. They need a certain extra facility in terms of being catered to by society at large, or being looked after by society at large, because they're performing this pro-social behavior of bringing a new life into and reproducing a society in some sense, their role in reproducing society. Um, so they're accorded an extra merit that is woven into or projected onto their character. So they're given this extra facility, this extra power. And so, because because you see a young female, in young adulthood, and she might have a very young child attached to her or something like that. She might have a very young child depending on her. And so perhaps women sense that psychosocially, or perhaps uh, their hormones themselves, in some sense, lend them to uh, uh, interpret society in that sense, that their biology already acclimatizes them um, towards that kind of behavior and function. Um, and so there's a psychological component to that, a contemplative component to that. So anyway, what the borderline has done is they've taken that, either that psychosocial facility that women get handed, or they have taken the internal psychological inclination, and they've attached it to their own subconscious. So essentially, their subconscious um, uh, uh, their subconscious um, masks their subconscious attachment devices that they wish to hook into other people's subconscious minds. They are their small infants. So the borderline is like a narcissist and their own little infant child, which they have to protect, and which has this envy, um, uh, 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 this job of performing this envy concealment. So their envy concealment device in their subconscious is their small infant. And so they have access to developing that machination within their inner child, because these subconscious throwaway devices, which they can recapitulate and refuse together and make new robots when the old ones fail, they just, they blow them apart and they sew them together and make new ones, and they just keep on creating new iterations until one of them works, until one of them sticks. And some of those iterations are just completely, they're just completely testing the environment, scanning the environment for someone um, coherent and strong enough to be prone to that is worth being manipulated. Because that's the biggest problem of the borderline, is they can't find someone who's even worthy to be manipulated. Because if someone isn't powerful enough, there's no point in controlling them. So you have to sort of generally test the environment for someone who seems to have some power of some dominion of some kind or something like that. Um, and that's generally what I think is happening when borderlines are just being vaguely disruptive, generally disruptive. They're scanning their environment in some sense, because they have high standards, because their inner child has very high standards in terms of what they want to be granted. And so anyway, they have found the second facility of the infant, of the category of the infant, that doesn't matter. It's crying. It's a crying infant. It must be attended to. Jordan Peterson has gone into this this analogy in terms of looking into it. That the ideology of social justice, in some sense, where society or the identity takes on this character. I believe that it's true for borderlines on the micro scale. That it's true that the borderlines subconscious facets and masks and different valences and different personalities, which they compile at will, en masse, and they cycle through them until one of them works, until one of them gets gets attached or gets accepted or gets contracted with. The problem is that it's not stable, because even if somebody lets in one of these clones, lets in one of these iterations, then it's weird, because then suddenly it also becomes a chameleon. It changes, because it as soon as anything goes backwards, and so if any obligation or any expectation goes both ways, it just melts, and then a new one appears in its place. A new one takes its place, and it's saying a slightly different story. So it's very corrosive to the host in some sense, and but but the borderline is very sharply um, that no, you've in principle you've let in the infant, therefore you can't stop caring for it. And then, the ostensible thing will be like, well, you were just asking for a specific sort of thing. You were this kind of infant. Now you've suddenly become a different infant suddenly overnight, like or 10 minutes from now. So the characteristic need of the infant is just, it changes in such a radical way, such a non sequitur way, in such a convoluted and contrived way as well, that it's obviously a sort of a Trojan horse of manipulation. And sort of a non-stop, complete asymmetrical, subjugated and denigrating control vector. And then borderlines sort of double down on this, and they kind of flip it into the histrionic moral sanctimony to sort of cover it. And then they're like, okay, let's not talk about reason itself. Let's not talk about this on a meta level. Let's not talk about this in a deep, coherent level where things make sense. Then they flip the script into the histrionic, technical alignment and rational alignment. So borderlines, that's what they do. Is like when someone is sort of undermining their tactics and their manipulation, which in some sense they are very prone to do, because borderlines are just so devastatingly incoherent. They are just so, it's so corrosive that you have to actually find a way to investigate what's at the core of this, and try to find resolution. And as soon as someone tries to find a kind of resolution, or a kind of, then they put on the waterworks, or they really flip the script, and they talk in this kind of in these moral tones of sanctimonious self-righteousness and self-pity. And they essentially create, they focus on the so, and it looks very bad, because essentially they are facilitating their ego filter by covering it with the ego, with the envy concealment, and which is this very brittle ego function, which is so disjointed and up in the air. It's like, and it's obviously protecting a cognitive dissonance, and this is the kind of pathetic intellectualism that everyone commented about the Nazis. Everyone thought that the Nazis were too fucking stupid to take over. Everyone thought that they were LARPing, and that, the Nuremberg rallies and things like that it was just bullshit, because they were clowns. Everyone thought Hitler was a clown, and he is a clown intellectually. He is an intellectual midget. The whole thing is a kind of a psychological Ponzi scheme. But for the people that actually are emulating this ideology, that they are this kind of hybridized personality disordered thing, this is their behavior. This is reality to them. This is how it works. This is the game, how it is played, and there's no other game in town. And essentially, it just comes from believing in the canonical premise that the identity categories are sacrosanct, and therefore, that's a given. So we don't go back and relook at those things. Of course, you can categorize reality through these kinds of generalizations, and then we can make generalizations upon generalizations and rationalize them and put them into a rational alignment and get all the facts to sort of puzzle together in that sort of matrix. And then and then you can just complain at someone for throwing that matrix off, for skewing it slightly, for trying to make it look like it doesn't have a perfect alignment. And essentially the only reason why it doesn't have a perfect alignment is because there hasn't been enough concerted work, and we haven't found all the puzzle pieces yet. But if we did, it would be perfect. And that's the Ponzi scheme, essentially. Okay, so you have to understand also that all of these things are operating at the same level in terms of the inner child and the unconscious side of the mind. And at some point, it knows that it's dealing in intellectual fraud. It knows that what it's dealing in is completely incoherent, but they're not willing to change those structures. They're not willing to revise that, because that's the private subjective space That's your subjective truth. That's like everyone is allowed to have their island, and it doesn't matter how much project, because everyone is doing projection onto things. They've got, uh, the borderline aspect of the ideology is quite intuitive and forgiving of its own machinations in some sense. And borderlines, therefore, are progenitors of this kind of psychosocial toxin, because they are automatically trying to acclimatize people into this kind of cultural intellectual sympathy that covers, the mediocrity and the incoherence and uh, the quite monstrous set, because it is greed at the end of the day, that they just want to be granted something to their personage, to their self-image, to their self-portrait, or to some kind of category. um, and they've got these little belief expectation bundles in their mind, which is, it says women have this complaint for having this difference, and so they've got all these different beliefs that they can kind of key into and use to leverage and use to concoct. They've got all these bundles of data in their inner child, which they can use to um, uh, uh, cobble together a particular subconscious mask, a particular subconscious front, um, uh, that when it attaches itself delivers this envelope of expectations to be catered to. And the problem is that, like, those things are so, even in their premises, they are wrong, because it's just a kind of, it's like spin doctoring essentially, but it's somebody else to clean up the details, to sort of to make the expectation work, to make the entitlement dignified, to somehow dignify the entitlement after the fact, because it's an oversimplification. It's an over reduction. It's an over, like, that's not how the world works. That's not even, the idea is that men on average in statistics get something that women don't have, or have something more that women don't have, but they don't care about why. That they believe they know why that is the reason, and it's because of badness, and that's just the expectation. That's part of the package um, that is consigned for the other person to do the work on. Um, th- th- that is jettisoned off to the host, and they can't exist without that formulaic bond. Because they don't want to do any of the work. The subconscious is just there to attach to somebody else's, to get their ego function to become a kind of um, furor of arbitrating and just fulfilling their expectation in some sense. Just delivering whatever the infant so wishes, satisfying the infant's passions. Um, and the infant essentially just, you can't make the infant grow up. Um, and that, so I mean, like, that's the general sort of formula of the borderline is that, um, in the same way that a toddler can be a sort of a perfect, sort of like a toddler that's sort of engaged in this kind of borderline manipulation, never has to grow up, because it's a perfect balance of a kind of a cognitive dissonance balanced against another cognitive dissonance, and they can both sort of wash the hand of the other. Okay, so I did just want to talk about the sex differences. That's actually why I made this recording. Is just the that it might just be hormones. It might really just be hormones, because I mean, hormones are what create the differences between very, very young boys and girls, which there are tremendous differences, and that's because very young males have like more testosterone in them per unit blood than boys going through puberty, and this is changing the formation of the brain, and this is why very, very young boys are more interested in toys that depict, sort of engineering and things, and trains and things that map onto uh, uh, objects and motion, and why girls are interested in people in some sense. They're modeling scenarios and things like that. So, I mean, my guess is that it might just be that the defense mechanism is already sort of plugging into the way in which that essentially men develop slower. Um, like women are already developing essentially some subconscious insights in some sense, very, very young. They're developing their inner child and their subconscious um, in a much whereas boys, I think, are generally obviously they have a naive subconscious, but they take more time to develop the inner child, the vanity, and that's why boys generally will develop narcissism, and girls um, will sort of already have a foot in both camps when they're developing their pathological personality disorder, and so their personality disorder is connected between two sides of the mind. Anyway, that's all I have to say. It's a bit messy, I guess, but that's all the. I think, yeah, I just sort of had to add that for the sex differences, but it's interesting because I mean Sam Vaknin always tries to give his little. To tell you the truth, I really see it as a kind of a histrionic quirk of a kind of intellectual sandcastle of how women are superior or some shit like that. I mean, yeah, if you have a more integrated inner child and subconscious, even in a pathological sense, it's going to look more sophisticated. It's going to look more calibrated, and some women, they do have that sense about them that they can sort of um, conjure up and animate a kind of they can make dreams and fantasies come alive. They have this sort of creative force uh, 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 that they are kind of nurturing in some sense, because um, they connect with their inner child. They can create subconscious representations of their belief structures in their inner child. They can access them. Um, they perhaps seem more in tune with the unconscious side of the mind in some sense, because they were integrating it sooner, and so they have deeper. On average, they have deeper access to their inner child through their subconscious functioning in some sense, which means that they have more emotional circuitry that can go wrong, as it were. As well. They have more, on average, they have more sophisticated emotional circuitry, um, which leads for more. Um, yeah, so I mean, there are positives and negatives to that. Um, and again, this is that's more of a statistical argument as well. But and men are more, have thicker skins, as it were, because they've had to develop their inner child in isolation from their subconscious. They've kept their subconscious naive for longer, before sort of jumping that gap. You can see this. I know I was going to give an example, but that's probably an example of something else. It's probably not an example of what I just wanted to depict. So let me not even say it, because then I'll look stupid. Uh, I'll I'll just say what the example would have been, but I think this is a bad example to use. But essentially, um, yeah, might even be the example of the opposite, actually. So it's a very bad example. Is when some people will not talk at a very young age, and they obviously know that they obviously could talk, but they choose not to talk because they want a better vocabulary. They want a larger vocabulary before they start talking. But I don't even want to get into that because that will derail me, and that I think is not an example of depicting what I'm looking for. Although you can see thematically why I thought that it might pertain, but I actually think that that doesn't, and why it might be, in fact, the case of the opposite. Because then already you're quite invested into a subconscious, some kind of subconscious, in some sense, let's say uh, the stereotypical boy in, because this is a general sort of, I'm talking generally here, but so the stereotypical boy, you know, doesn't care about the subconscious mask to some extent. He's so focused on his own development, he's so focused on his own internal understanding and his own internal coherence from his base, which is developed in isolation to the subconscious for longer, that he just has to actually get things right. It's more important that he understands how the world works and he actually learns. So it doesn't matter if he looks stupid when he learns. Like he won't have that kind of, he won't develop that same kind of subconscious, um, that sense of trying to build the subconscious credibility or build the subconscious standing, um, or resilience. He's uh, you know, what females would interpret as male privilege, essentially, that, oh, you're allowed to look stupid. And in some sense they don't realize that, in some sense, well, that's because they don't have any, that it's because they don't have female privilege to try to to work with, and to they don't have something to lose. They don't have the female privilege to lose, or to denigrate, or to sacrifice, or to surrender. So women are really resentful of their own extra powers in some sense. It's quite, oh, men get to enjoy their male disposability so that they can actually become competent and actually reach high status, so that women will actually notice them, and in some sense, because there is that huge asymmetry where women just have value. They just have a pro-social biological value in some sense, whereas men have to earn that value. Men have to earn the food that they eat in some sense. um, they have to earn their mate. They have to compete against other men. Women aren't just going to by default acquiesce anything, and women are actively creating this game in some sense, and they're creating the competition between the suitors. And I mean, this is another thing that we have to look at, to the extent to which capitalism and our whole society is run. Although it's been called patriarchal, um, it might as well be called matriarchal, as far as I can see. In some sense, calling it patriarchal is to blame the victim, to tell you the truth. Because I would say culturally, women are in control. And in some sense, that's why they didn't have any political control, because they didn't want to be bogged down with the responsibility. And we can kind of see that flaring up culturally, thematically, that they're not capable of dealing with it. That essentially their standards are just too high, as it were. They're not willing to get down and do the work with everyone else. They care more about just preserving their female privilege, which in some sense was being facilitated better when they didn't have those rights. But I mean, obviously, we're dealing with the most pathological variant of the feminine um, consciousness at the moment, that has been empowered and been given cultural hegemony. Obviously, if because essentially we haven't done the work of real equality, which is to actually criticize women they have not received the same criticism that men have known from a young age. They do not receive that same level of invigilation. They live in a different system, and what we are seeing is the kind of the secondary effect of that two-tier system, as it were. That these princesses and these snowflakes, which and the lie is that we're allowed to all be snowflakes. We just need to get a rainbow Hitler in charge, and then we can all be snowflakes, and we can share out the same sort of power. And it's not true. It's not. You can't function a society that way. Someone has to take responsibility, and for them, it's just the scapegoat. It's the white male privilege is the scapegoat of the entire system, and out of that resource, everything will be everything, all the entitlements will be paid. You know, it's it really all comes down to what happened to accountability and responsibility. Where did that concept go? Where did that? How is that being accounted for in the belief structure? But they don't want to talk about beliefs. They just want to talk about feelings. Okay, so and their moral certitude is in the feelings and not in the beliefs, which is why the the sandcastle Ponzi scheme continues. So anyway, okay, so I've kind of covered this a few times from the different sort of ideological aspects, but yeah, you see, it is fine. I mean, men have been policing themselves forever. You know, but women have been this sacred ground that you're not allowed to criticize women, and so because that same criticism can't limit the pathologies that women are prone to, we've become vulnerable to them and susceptible to them. And until we kind of get a handle on borderline personality disorder and its formula and its themes and its ideological manifestations, uh, you know, we're going we're going to have a horrible end of the Mayan calendar. We're going to have an implosion, a cultural implosion. I mean, we're facing the cultural peak of this. It's all come to a head. It's all come into focus, and the solution is really quite simple, and it's a psychological technology of understanding in some sense, and it's a we need a culture that has better values, that has a better ethical system, that is actually willing to apply non-sexualism or non-sexism and non-racialism as a way to clear up this disgusting corruption and this disgusting garbage and its secondary effects of its fascistic intellectuals and fascistic academics and their mediocrity, where essentially those fields are so weak, the science is so weak, the intellectualism is so weak that you can just buy your degree essentially because it's just such garbage. It's just such utter watered down, incoherent bullshit. And you know, this is the well, this is the future that we have to contemplate if we don't stand up and confront this monster. Um, and I think recapture how good we had it under essentially neoliberalism. People don't realize the cultural height, the I mean, the things that people complain about in terms of neoliberalism. Why are people throwing neoliberalism under the bus? Um, I mean, this idea that it imposes global values. No, it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily do any of that. That's just a failing of culture because culture didn't know how fucking good it had it. Um, Neoliberalism ensured like a kind of a very effective a form of global peace in some sense. Um, it was just up to culture to sort of get it to act together and police itself, and instead, all the goodness that neoliberalism essentially, all the potential goodness that neoliberalism generated, was squandered in developing a disgusting political virtue signaling way for elites to not be responsible their electorate, to their electorate, to the electorate, and to delude them with moral corruption, which facilitated actual corruption and government corruption and misspending, because identity politics and such is just such a piss poor way to have any kind of policy to run a government. Malaysia is the perfect example of this. They had affirmative action for a very short period of time, and then they scrapped it all, and then they just decided to develop their country intelligently, and now they are richer than my country, South Africa. And if you look from where Malaysia started and where South Africa started, it's a story of two different. It's the story of identity politics versus being an actually decent and morally virtuous government like Malaysia that actually did the right thing, and they didn't invest into this toxic identity consciousness, and they just did the work of developing their country, instead of getting into this disgusting racialism and this disgusting fascistic bullshit, and everything else that comes along with it. And instead, South Africa, we have to sit with disgusting fascists like Echile Mbembe, Echile. I'm not sure how to pronounce his first name. I haven't listened to anything where he was introduced in a while, but where we have that level of academic sowing the seeds of racialist, undermining the Constitution, damaging the Constitution, tearing it up, and promoting its betrayal, and this disgusting ideological creed, which is indistinguishable from fascism. They have just replaced Aryan studies with its genetic superiority with race and gender studies and its moral superiority. Absolutely indistinguishable, just a slightly different mythology, just a slightly different collective experience, historical projection that is imputed onto the present as a kind of collective guilt, which is even animated in policy. So actually, what supposedly is meant to fix social justice or ensure it is actually destroying people's social justice, because it imposes a kind of collective guilt, which also allows them to give benefits to an oligarchical black elite, which, because they're indistinguishable, because race is the proxy, it's not disadvantage. None of the policy targets disadvantage effectively. It only targets the superficial proxy. And that's exactly how they want it, because that's how you can conduct a corrupt state. And so we have one. And it's all facilitated by the moral corruption and by the betrayal of the Constitution. Which I will concede does have to be read in a very keen way. It does have to be read intelligently. It can't just be read with this kind of bad faith and this kind of narcissistic, borderline personality disordered ideology going in your head. If you've got that and you read the Constitution, yes, you can interpret it to say whatever the hell you want it to. But the fascists were always good at doing that with legal theory. Okay, I'm going to stop this rant. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. And I could complain more about the public intellectuals and the disgusting political kinds of sentiments in my country. It's very depressing. This is a bit embarrassing to sort of go back 3 recordings and add some ancillary notes. But I think it's an interesting thing to point out that in the same way that I opined that essentially that part of the reason why there is such a difference between men and women from at least a cultural perspective is because of how criticism is not levied against women. In some sense, that was the last piece of the puzzle to actually having true egalitarianism, is subjecting women to the same level of criticism that men are prone to, and that would have essentially evened things out in some sense. But it also would have made women more like men. And perhaps, the feminists themselves are on 2 minds on this front in some sense. They can't actually, we're sat with this intrinsic, insoluble problem that you can't be separate and equal. So are you really going to ask for separate treatment and then still claim equality in some sense? Uh, and then you can't define equality therefore as the same treatment and then demand separate treatment. So it's like, how's that ever going to be reduced into something that functions even conceptually? It's just fundamentally fudged and incoherent, and it continues this sort of Ponzi scheme of passing the buck forward or something. But okay, so I kind of messed up describing that problem, but I mean that at least you get what I'm talking about vaguely. So I just wanted to say that the same thing exists not just between the differences, because I was explaining when I went into this that the borderline tactic is to leverage differences, and obviously racial differences are another superficial thing that can be used in exactly the same way. And you can leverage statistics, and you can leverage often dishonest readings of statistics, and uh, to create the systemic accusations of a systemic imposition and things like that. And again, I think the solution is much the same thing. That the actual tangible difference, that let's say if there is a kind of systemic induction towards people having a mediocre outcome, a more mediocre outcome, is because they are shielded from the criticism that keeps, let's say, the more functional racial category, what actually keeps that racial category functioning in the sense that it does, is because of its self-regulation, its comportment of responsibility and accountability, as it were, um, that is alive within the culture itself, which doesn't exist in certain of these subcultures, which are essentially welded to sort of low expectations and mediocrity, because essentially, oh well, it's okay, it doesn't matter how mediocre it is because we're systemically oppressed anyway. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy on that kind of level. But anyway, it's the same thing with the toxic feminism. Essentially, it's that same kind of how the projection of the narrative and the resent over that confects into actually making the real solution impossible, and the real solution being essentially, I guess it sounds like a bootstrap argument, but in some sense it's an ethical bootstrap argument, that if you don't feel that you have the handle on self-determinism, and if self-determinism is not something that someone in your category of difference is capable of achieving or handling or getting access to, something like that. So, I mean, I do see it more as a psychosocial problem, but it's not a psychosocial problem of the collective. It's a psychosocial problem of the subculture itself, that they are trapped within this cyclical feedback of their own toxic ideology, essentially. And then you can say that it's supported by the general system because the ideology is so toxic that people don't confront it. They don't say, no, you're wrong about the systemic oppression, because just what is you can just imagine what the kind of knee-jerk, violent, radical response is to that. And so, this is how these toxic borderline ideology, culture, sort of conventions get cemented and made space for within certain subcultures, and then you can't get rid of them. It's very hard to get rid of them. When Martin Luther King was doing his work, he had the Black Panthers essentially doing this kind of stuff with their communist systemic complaint. In fact, they sounded almost like Nazis complaining that you can never escape capitalism, that even if other countries essentially can't break from the capitalistic empire of America. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, how can you say that? Because countries choose not to end trade between them, that they are effectively part of an empire and that they are de facto colonized. I mean, how self-deluded must you be that essentially, because people will never essentially cross the line of their own self-interest to the extent to which that they will try to alienate their own country and become a kind of an insulated sort of ethno. You can see that the only thing that satisfies their solution is kind of ethno fascist autarky is the only solution that they're actually sort of demanding. And conceptually in their minds, because of their racialism, because they're premised in racialism, that is obviously the end game for them, and they're just leveraging narratives to support that. But okay, I'm going on a tangent. But anyway, these ancillary issues, I mean, you can see how they thematically tie into the borderline ideology stuff. Anyway, yeah, this is a bit of a. Obviously, this is an embarrassing voice note because it would have been better if I had put it in on the earlier recordings, but maybe I can tack it on to one of them where it pertains. Actually, let me